Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Dolores Project. Today, special guest is Mark Coeckelbergh. Mark, welcome to the show, and I'm glad you're here. You've written a book recently, or you've written a lot of work. It's hard to keep up with all the stuff that you publish so quickly, but one of the last books that you wrote is why I wanted to have a discussion today, and that is about self, technology, and how we understand ourselves through those things. So, Mark, let's go ahead and jump right into the conversation about the self. Before we get to the tech aspect, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you understand the self? What is that?
That's immediately quite a big philosophical question. For me, the self is a relational kind of thing. It does exist in the sense that there's definitely a story about us, and there's also feeling of being a self. So there is a self, but that self is never an isolated kind of thing, or it's not even a thing. It moves, it changes, and it's also something that's always connected with other people, with whatever happens around us. So that's the rough idea.
Yeah. So how did you what made you want to write the book on AI and self-improvement? What led yourself into the discovery of this book, and what are some things that you explored in your research that really drove you to unpack this in such a short, condensed book?
Yeah, all this started from the observation around me. Many people being busy with self-improvement, me too, but I noticed that many people today are busy with self-improvement in a very obsessive way. And that led me to read more about the phenomenon, very big phenomenon apparently. It turned out, especially in the US, but also in Europe, that many people are busy with themselves in that way. And so I wanted to find out more about that, and especially wanted to first understand what's going on. Why are we so self-obsessed? Where does that idea come from? I'm, as a philosopher, interested in the concepts and the ideas, so I wanted to look for that. And then I also developed some opinions about that, and wanted to think like, okay, how can I, as a philosopher, then make an argument about this, and what what kind of evaluation can we give of the phenomenon? And my intuition was that there's something definitely wrong about self-improvement in the way that it's done today, in an obsessive way, with lots of technology, and in a society that seems to force us to do so. So that was my starting point, and that led me then to do more research on the phenomenon, and to develop my argument.
So before we get into the modern self, which I know you and I both will have a lot of opinions on, you've written in other places, I think about the MIT book, AI Ethics. You wrote early on in that book that there was this connection between religion and technology and developments. But you also wrote in the self improvement book that there's a connection between the self and Protestant thinking and religious thinking in general. So, how do you think that in your research, how we thought about ourselves, how has that drastically changed? Has it drastically changed over the years as we get more into a modern self and thinking about the integration of technology into our bodies, into our minds? Has there been a major shift? Is it pretty much the same?
Yeah, and there's a lot of change. So of course, the change in the technologies, right? Use all kind of digital technologies today. We're on social media. We can use sort of even robotic technologies as we try to enhance ourselves, or we can use artificial intelligence to detect patterns in our behavior or in our brains. brain states, for example, that links a bit with the topic of religion, in the sense that there's a lot of interest in trying to reach different brain states, trying to reach Buddhist enlightenment, for example, and people try to do that in a technological way and think about it in a technological way. Um, but apart from the technologies, there's also different ideas. Whereas the ancients tried to reach the good life by having certain techniques like self-control and yeah, doing stuff with their mind. Later in modernity, there are very specific ideas of how this should be done. For example, in a Christian culture, both Catholic and Protestant Christian cultures, in the Catholic culture, there was the idea of confession. Um, so basically, back then, the idea was that you confess your sins to God, but now today, people confess on social media. They
Mm.
confess not to God, but to their fellow human beings. So you see those practices from the past getting back there. Same with self-control. Also, some kind of more Protestant way of showing off your virtue, for example, uh, by showing on social media how hard you work on yourself. So I find it interesting to look at these contemporary phenomena through the lens of these ancient and much older ways of thinking.
If you had to think about one particular ancient philosopher that represents the ancient world, how they understood themselves and identity, which one would you pick?
That's a very difficult question, because I think many of them have something to say, but I think one influential one was Seneca, Roman philosopher and Stoic, who took this idea from the Greeks, but further developed it and said, like, well, we need to think of ourselves and deal with ourselves in such a way that we don't worry so much about things we can't change, but but do try to change things what we can, and we can what we can change is our mind, and so we can try to be more stoic, as we say today. It's an idea that, as I said, came from the Greeks, but we can also find in Buddhism and related worldviews, where the idea is that you change your mind, you change yourself, because that's what you can do, and in that you will anyway influence the world around you and change things. But that's the place to focus on to start with. I think that has also influenced self-improvement ideas in the West.
Hmm. Yeah, do you think that we're still following that trajectory and mindset of the Stoics said, like, know yourself, and that is kind of how I think a lot of it, when I read them at least, is that you have the power to change yourself. The things that you don't like about you, the things that you find as negative, that the individual has power either through meditation or learning, whatever it is, to really change yourself. Do you think that we're still operating under that modality? Is it something completely different that's driving us, or is there a modern thinker that represents how we're thinking about the self?
But what happened in modernity is that we became more aware that society as a whole also really influences us and who we are. And there I'm very influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French Enlightenment philosopher, who worried that society, especially modern society, took so much influence on us that we no longer can be authentic. And that's a thought that continues to influence us today when we try to find authenticity, and do this by very modern means, by technological means. by interactions on social media, by measuring ourselves, by posting about how authentic we are, by traveling to places, and so on. And so I think our culture is influenced by that kind of idea of like desperately
Mm.
wanting to be authentic. Now, the problem with that is that, um, yeah, paradoxically, it leads to a culture of, what I call in the book hipster consumerism, where people, all do the same, buy the same kind of products in order to be authentic. So yeah, there is this phenomenon. I think it fits also with this obsessive idea again to know yourself in that particular modern way. And yeah, in the book I criticize that. I think we need to find different ways, not so much maybe to become authentic, because this self is very relational. Maybe, as the Buddhists say, doesn't even exist. But instead, rather work on ourselves, but not having that kind of goal.
You mentioned a lot in the book about the hipster consumerism stuff, and I think that's generally how it's depicted in media is pretty negative, right? As far as it's not our authentic self. And I think there's a paradox between how most people feel about themselves, at least as I know from a theologian and pastor, somebody who does just kind of general work with the public. And I think most people typically have a negative view of their self, just generally, either insecurity, they don't like the way they look, maybe they didn't receive the affirmation that they needed, or whatever it is, but generally seeking something outside validation and verification of love and affirmation. And technology has helped that in some ways. Like there's some deformative parts for sure, but there's also parts that I think help us. So what's your perspective, Mark, on how technology becomes a piece of this? Because it seems like both in the ancient world and the modern world, people are in a state naturally that they want to move on from. Most people want to better themselves or achieve something. Not everybody, certainly not everybody, but for most of us, we're seeking validation, affirmation, love, and how we go about that though is very different. So what are some ways that you've seen in your book that's deformative, like that's not good, and we can get back into the consumerism part of that, but also some ways that are formative and good and redemptive, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a good question. So basically, Rousseau makes a difference between two kinds of self-love. One is a natural kind of self-love, and probably something that we should have, right? So we should care about ourselves. We should take care of ourselves, and that's something that's increasingly stressed also today. And I think that's a very important insight. There is, however, a kind of self-love that's more toxic and problematic, and that is more the narcissistic kind of self-love. And yeah, as most ethical systems and religions say, that is not good. Is something that we need to get rid of. And with technology, we can work on ourselves, I think, in a way that is a way of taking care of yourself, and in a way that helps us. But we can also be inclined to use it in a narcissistic way, and I think the current technologies tend to push us a bit more towards the side of narcissism,
Hmm.
and a narcissism that is kind of, I tell the myth of Narcissus, who looks into the water mirrors him, and he doesn't get out of that and dies. And so I think it's something that we really need to get rid of, but that technology pushes us towards. The culture of the selfie, which is also now being criticized. in contemporary discourse. We need to make sure that the technologies we design and use, that they enable us a good kind of self-care and a good kind of self-improvement, and do not lead to this narcissistic toxic culture, which in the end, is not only good for individuals, but is also destroying the culture and society as a whole, which then again feeds back to the self, because the self is relational. If you grow up in the current culture, it is very difficult and it is very dangerous in that way, because the culture with the technologies, the technoculture, say, tries to make you into that kind of personality and that kind of self. So it's important here, I think, to make good individual choices. But also, the point of the book is saying, as a philosopher of technology, like, look, this is not just about your own individual choices. It's also the technology and the culture and the society that pushes you in a certain direction. And so that takes us to the point at the end of the book to say, like, well, if we really want change, we can't just expect this from individuals. It's not just up to you. We actually need to change society, and that's very important, I think, also in a modern culture where responsibility is always put on all on the shoulders of that poor individual, who has to be completely responsible for themselves. I think it's an idea we also inherited from the existentialists.
Mm.
um, I think it's wrong. It's wrong that we are 100% responsible for ourselves. We are also
Mm.
shaped by our environment, and if we want to change things, if we want to change ourselves, we need to change that wider society, the relations with others. Have different education, have different, build a different world together, and so that's the direction I think we need to go in.
Yeah, I think I agree, and I appreciated that part of the book where you're not only giving us problems and philosophizing about tech, but you're also kind of pointing us to a solution, and that's the latter part of the book, and I appreciated that, and I think sometimes we can only focus on the object and forget that we should have some type of solution kind of behind our critique of these things, because typically, Mark, what I see just in the general public is there's a generation who grew up without some of these technologies that are geared towards the self, right? Think about Snapchat, TikTok, and YouTube, where the algorithm is giving you what you want to see. It's trying to replicate what you want as a user. And there are generations that grew up without that. And I don't think sometimes people understand the pressure of being formed by those algorithms of, constantly information before you, and using YouTube like a search engine and all those things, and how a lot of kids, I think especially, they're being formed in ways that they don't really understand, nor do they have the emotional and cognitive development to really handle some of that stuff. I mean, just think about being a teenager and the pressure that you might feel where you're constantly in contact with online presence of other people and marketing and all these different things. And I think a lot of parents are rightly concerned about those things, and they should be, but they just don't know what to do. Like they have no clue, what do we do with all this stuff? How do my kid wants to be involved in the wider piece of society and their culture and their classmates. So either I make them a digital monk, or I give them limited or full access sometimes to the social web. And there's all these different ideas about what we should do. But what would you say, Mark? Like, you're thinking about this as a young parent, and your kid comes home and says, "Hey, I want a Instagram account. I want to start a YouTube channel." what advice would you give to them as they're thinking about themselves and their digital self? Like, are there differences between the two, and how would you help us to think about those things? I know that's a broad question.
Hmm. That's a broad question indeed, and but it's a very important one, and a very very practical and urgent one, because many parents are indeed worrying about this. I think it it's one thing that probably doesn't help is to ban stuff, because then as a teenager you're actually going to look for it, so that's not going to work. So I think what we need is of course accept that technologies are there, and that we have new media, because there's also a bit of always this typical pessimistic attitude that you see just with every new technology that's being developed, and it's claimed that it's going to destroy the whole culture. And I don't want to sound like this, though. Sometimes in the book I'm very critical, but you see it with a lot of people that at the time of television was going to destroy culture, and now it's going to be AI and so on. So I think we have to be a little bit critical of such claims. Nevertheless, I do, of course, in the book and elsewhere, really, I see it as my job to point to the ethical and political problems that come from the new technologies. So the way to do it, with from YouTube to ChatGPT, is to say like, okay, let's you know ideally as a parent sit down with our kids and you know teach them how to relate to these technologies in a more critical way, in a way that doesn't get them too much into trouble. For example, in a careful way when it comes to privacy, and also in a way that like makes them realize, in the case of ChatGPT, that this is not a person, and it's not necessarily telling the truth and so on. So I think we can do a lot of things there. The problem is that this requires educating the parents as well, right? So we need a broader effort, I think, in general in our societies, to spend enough time and money on educating people, not just young people, but
Mm.
everyone, in order to also play that parental role, and in order to indeed deal with it at a later age too. There are many people also at later age who use these technologies but might not always be prepared for them. So there's a lot of work to do, I think, and I think that can be done if we realize that these technologies are not mere tools, but are really having all these kind of unintended effects and problems. So we need a broader education, I think, about all kind of risks next to the possibilities that are associated with these technologies.
Yeah, I think that's wise, and even Mark, I've heard you say in other places, and I don't know specifically where in your writing, but I've heard you say that you know as we think about the self, as we think about me as a person and you as a person, that we're not just one localized individual, autonomous and free, right? In some ways we are, but that's built on a scaffolding, as you've said. So we think about the environment, we think about our ancestors and grandparents, and all those things make us who we are today. And you can't remove those pieces. And I think in a lot of ways, the modern self has tried to do that. It's like try to take apart the scaffolding to say it's just me, and I'm self-made. I can, and I see that in the ancient world as well. And you have writers like Saint Paul, who wrote in First Corinthians, Second Corinthians, a good bit about the way that we should think about the self is as to to use his word translated from the Greek is to think about enslavement, not chattel slavery, but to think about how I should see myself in relation to the community, is that I'm literally giving myself to them. And that is a biblical theological way to think about it, but I think also in a lot of relational philosophy like you and others have developed, it's that's also a piece of it. And now I don't think that you would use the word enslavement, but what Paul is saying here is, you should consider your brother, your sister, your neighbors more than you consider yourself, and that our mode of operation should naturally be, I'm more concerned about this generation than I am mine. I'm more concerned about my neighbor over here than I am about my own personal well being. And I think that really flips the whole script and narrative about how we think about AI, robots, and tech in general. It's not doom and gloom apocalypse, as we think about what's this going to do to me, but how can we reshape this? And I think some of it is, especially in the generation before us, and I think about like boomers and stuff, where so much of the conversation is about shame and hurt and alienation. It's almost like we other the generation below me, and think about Generation Z, where they grew up online. It's they're I think they don't see themselves separated between online and offline. I don't agree with that, but I think that's how they're thinking about the self. And so um, I think you're right as far as education goes. There's just not enough material on the market, either in publications, trade, academic, about how to address practical concerns for each generation. So that's why I recommend your work to people. And you can't keep up with what Mark publishes. He is a prolific writer and does quite well to explain some of these concepts. And so parents out there listening definitely want to point you to the direction of Mark's work. And Mark, I do want to ask, as I think about this and think about your work, they said Generation Z sees themselves online, offline self. It's the same. How do you think that changes as we move into conversations about AR glasses and augmented reality, the metaverse, and those type of things? Do you think the next generation or the generation after will see the online self completely immersed in the same way that we see embodied in-person conversation? Will there be a difference
Mhm.
in the future between the digital and offline self?
Well, I think that our perception of this will change indeed. I think we will not see the online self as so different. I think that's already happening, as you indicated. And there's also truth in that. I mean, there's a truth in saying that there is a relation between, the online and the offline, because our lives are pervaded by these technologies. You can't say that the person online now, for example, that's talking has nothing to do with the person, Mark Coeckelbergh, who's sitting here at his desk. There is a relation which I conceptualize in terms of performance. We perform, and in that sense, it doesn't matter so much online, offline. Um, However, what is there online cannot be reduced to what is offline, and one reason, for example, for this is that we have a body. We are embodied beings. And another reason one could argue that there is this inner experience which cannot be reduced to what is out there in the world, to what is mediated by technologies. That's more tricky because that brings up the question, is that self? Is there an authentic self? Is there a core kind of self? Um, but in any case, I think it's clear that there is no one-to-one similarity or equality between these two. But in that other sense that I first said, like, there is a truth in it. We are becoming, there's one world, and there's different experiences in that world, and different mediations and different forms of change. So in I think this topic should not be reduced to saying like, oh, all we need to do ethically is take distance from that online self, which has nothing to do with me. That's also not right. But it is very difficult because that online self is out there, is very vulnerable, especially in the case of children. And yeah, we need to also teach people to be resilient against whatever can happen to that online self. So there's there's work to do in that direction, but I think it's, philosophically speaking, also important to realize that we cannot and should not hide in one world to protect ourselves for the other world. I think it's about learning to live in this mixed kind of world, in this hybrid kind of world, where we are in different kind of realities,
Mm.
and across these realities try to reach some self integrity and self reach become a good self.
Hmm. I have two follow-up questions to that. The first one is there a particular piece of science fiction? Because sometimes I think science fiction gets a lot of the questions right. Sometimes it gets a lot of stuff wrong. That you think will has made a prediction about the future. For example, there's a comic book called Clear, and it kind of projects that there will be a future where everybody sees what they want to see, right? So everything is augmented reality, and you take a pill or you have an implant, and you don't see the world as it actually is, which is very dystopian and dirty and ugly. You see exactly what you want to see. I think that's pretty close to where we're headed. What's a piece of science fiction that you think, man, they really have done a good job kind of prophesying about where we're headed?
I mean, about the pills, that reminds me again, of course, of the more narcissistic kind of risk, right? That you basically all the technology personalizes your world so much that you know in the end you look in the mirror, but the problem is that if a self that only looks in the mirror dies or cannot even develop, right? Because I think you
Mm,
can only develop in relation to the outside world, in relation to others, in relation also to some friction. Though we don't want too much friction, of course, but I think there needs to be some friction for you in order to develop. And if you the idea of a smooth kind of feedback loop where you only look in that all too smooth mirror, I think that's a way of saying like, well, we're gonna kill the self, or we're not even starting with
mm,
developing it. So we need to get away from that. In
mm,
terms of other science fiction that is interesting, I think I like the kind of science fiction that brings a social and political element to all this, where yeah, the science fiction portrays, for example, how society gets more and more divided once you have all these technologies in place. That some people get very much enhanced by technologies, for example, but not everyone gets the chance to do that. And we see already a bit of that today, that like some people are left behind, not so much the previous generations, which was first the case. I think today boomers, for example, use a lot of these technologies, so it's no longer the case that this is a massive amount of people that don't know how to use the technology. I think what's more a problem is that at a global scale, that the global south is you know left out partly, or that within society divisions between categories of social economic categories get more pronounced. And that's something that worries me, that all these great new technologies produce a brave new world for the rich, but produce a horrible world for the poor. So for me, the question regarding technology is not only an ethical one concerning self as such, but is also one that's political. Like, what kind of world do we want to live in, and how do we want to live together? Is for me very important, and that partly starts from the individual, of course, starts from self-improvement. And I think, yeah, modern interpretations of religions are good in stressing that. But there's also a need, I think, for structural change. It's not easy to say exactly what needs to happen there, but it's definitely a level where, what I argue in the book, that where we need to see change in order to, create this environment where cells can develop and thrive, where um, human persons can flourish and have good lives together. So I think that should be the aim, and I think changing society is a way to get closer to that aim.
That's great. So my second question is related and kind of where you ended about the good society, the good life, the good self as relation to a good society. What does that look like for you, Mark? And this doesn't have to be a political argument, and I'll talk about your book in a second, but what does that look like for you? Just practically, ideally, what's a good balance between, hey, I'm developing as a self, and also I'm putting technology in its proper place. Um, do you see advanced AI and robotics as a part of that ecosystem? Is it not a part of that? Which way would you have us go, ideally, if you were the philosopher
Mhm.
king?
Well, that's a difficult question, and there's a lot of one can say about what a good society could be. I think a good society is definitely, with relation to in relation to technology, is one where these advanced technologies um, help us indeed to develop, help us to flourish, and where they don't lead to a society where there is the division I talked about, where they also don't lead to a society where the natural environment is so much degraded and so problematic, for example, as a result of climate change,
Mm,
that all this flourishing becomes the rather question of survival. I think we should create a society where survival is no longer the issue. In in political philosophy, there is the idea of an idea by Thomas Hobbes, that if we leave people to themselves, in, naturally that they will just fight with one another, and then his solution is we need an authoritarian government, basically to create peace. I don't agree with this anyway, and I deal with this in my book Green Leviathan, which is, by the way, a biblical metaphor, of course. But what I do think is that what politics, part of what politics should be about, is trying to create a situation that avoids, the very starting point of Hobbes, meaning that we shouldn't have a situation where people have to fight for survival. We need to create decent and just societies where people don't have to do that, where people can focus on indeed self development, self improvement, and living well with other people. I think that kind of direction gives more guarantee to true self improvement, rather than all kind of cells and persons trying to survive in a in this digital world that becomes increasingly harsh and increasingly brutish and nasty, to use words that Hobbes um, used.
Mark, could you tell us a little bit about your most recent book, The Political Philosophy of AI, and anything else you want to share with us about that work?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the political philosophy of AI is, in a way, uh, a book that, yeah, that's very much related the more political direction I take in self-improvement and other recent work, saying like, look, we shouldn't only think about the ethics of digital technologies like AI, if that means just ethics at the individual level, like, where is my privacy, where are my rights, but also about political problems and challenges that are related to these technologies. And yeah, the basis of that book is the recognition, which is inspired by many decades of philosophy of technology, to say that technologies are themselves political, that even if they are not meant to be political, that they do have these political implications. And what I do in the book is saying, like, okay, let's take some concepts from political philosophy like freedom, justice, democracy, and see what do they mean today in our society, in a society that's deeply shaped by the new technologies, including AI. And then I get to problems, of course, like justice, which I just touched upon when I said there is this division, but also freedom. I see that what's happening today is that often one thing that's happening is that because of the fear and the vulnerability people feel in these online environments, that there are arguments then for limiting expression of free expression of speech. And while I do think that in a democracy it's necessary to have some limits on that, I think these limits should be probably given that freedom is also valued next to justice and other values. That probably these limits should be set in a way that still largely respects freedom of speech and expression of what people want to say. It's a very difficult problem. It's a problem that's already known in political philosophy for a long time. Um, but I think it's important to realize that when we deal with technologies and regulate them, that it's that we should respect all kind of values that are there, including freedom and democracy. um, and not in a kind of fear reaction against these technologies throw away important values, including freedom, justice, and democracy. So yeah, it's in a way a plea for thinking carefully about what we're doing, both in regulation but also in just letting things happen. Also looking at the power of big tech, for example, to be careful about what kind of world we're creating if we just let these technologies be developed in the way they are doing now, and regulated in the way they're being regulated. So yeah, it gives some kind of guidance, some normative guidance to dealing with AI and related technologies.
Yeah, and I'm grateful for your work in that, Mark, and other things that you've written that have been very helpful. And hopefully, I'll link all those books below that we've discussed throughout this conversation. And Mark, I just want to say thank you for your time. I know it's a little bit later where you are in your part of the world, and so I'm grateful for you and your work. And yeah, take care.
It has been a pleasure.